Thank you for tuning in to watch or to listen to this message today. Wherever you are, at home, in your car, on your computer, on your phone, we're just excited that you're spending time with us. We are on a mission here at CRB to lead people to know and love Jesus. And so if you call this place your home, I encourage you to visit our Give page on our website, where you can find a few easy ways to faithfully support God's work here at the church, financially, through online giving. At CRB, we believe that love will save the world, and the best place to do that is in the local church. So if you live in San Diego or if you're visiting the area, we just want to invite you to come join us on a weekend, come hang out with us, and be a part of the family here. Enjoy the message.
Good. We all know the earlier you wake up, the more spiritual you are. So just want to say welcome to our most spiritual service. These are the real Christians. We've been wondering. This is it. It's good to see you. If we have any prayer requests, we'll bring it to this group right here. My name's Jared, one of the pastors on staff here. Those of you that know me, you know my wife, her name's Rosanna, is pregnant. And a few several weeks ago, my wife, Rosanna, broke her foot, which is never fun at any stage of life, is it? It's especially not fun when you're 7 months pregnant and you have 2 little kids to chase around. And I know some of you are going to ask me later, so I'll go ahead and tell you the story. It's true. She slipped on a Lego. True story. I'm convinced Lego is the Hebrew word for devil, just between you and me. So we will not be going to Devil Land this summer, in case you're wondering. We're now SeaWorld people. Just kidding. It's not the Hebrew word. Some of you will email me that later. Is that really the... But she got the cast off, and those of you that have had an injury like that before, you know that often, even after you get the cast off, even after the doctor says you're okay, the injury can remain tender. And someone can bump into the injury, or someone can step on your foot, or someone can bump into the broken bone, even after the cast is gone. And there's that sort of, and you have to explain to them, it's not your fault. You didn't cause the injury. It happened a long time ago, but you just bumped into the injury. Perhaps you've had a sunburn before. Of course you have. You live in San Diego, and someone slapped you on the back, and you had to explain to them, it's not your fault. I got a sunburn. There is an injury, and you just bumped into the injury. We're in the middle of this series called Family Rules, or House Rules, where we're just from the scriptures every single week looking at a different story, an Old Testament story of a family, and from these stories sort of pulling out new rules for our families to operate by in terms of sons and daughters. Last week, my brother from another mother, Pastor Harry, did an amazing job talking about grandparenting from the story and from the life of David. And so every single week we've been looking at a different house rule. And I tell you that story about Rosanna because that same scenario that gets played out with physical pain often can get played out, especially in family dynamics and family relationships, with emotional pain. Where something happened in the past. There was an injury, there was a divorce, there was an affair, there was, that 2 weeks they told you they were going to come stay, and it ended up being 2 years. There was that thing that happened. There was that Christmas dinner where it just blew up and it became an argument, where nobody spoke for a long time, or there's that family member that nobody quite knows what to do with. And there's been an injury in the past, and somebody in the present, maybe your husband, maybe your wife, maybe your kids, will bump into that injury that it just never fully healed. And so I want to explore together today, how do we reconcile? How do we go back and heal things in order to go forward? Maybe it's a brother or sister, you grew up and you were really close. And somewhere along the way in life, they took a different path, or you took a different path. And you were close growing up, but maybe somewhere along the way there were some heated words exchanged, and you just lost touch, and you think, we were so close. How did we lose touch over the conflict? How did the relationship end up falling apart? And most of the time you're fine. But occasionally you'll hear that song, or occasionally at Christmas, it just bothers you. Something will bump into the injury and sort of reopen the wound. Maybe it's a son or a daughter that is an adult. And maybe you got married to somebody new and they didn't like the new. And they told you in very specific terms that they were not happy with your new decisions or your new family. And you think, how did I lose touch with my son or my daughter? Why did they say the things that they said? And most of the time you're fine, but around Christmas or around their birthday or whatever it is, if you could push a magic button and put it back together, you would. But something happens that bumps into the injury again and again and again. And so I want to explore, because I would imagine for all of us, when it comes to these weird, things that God gives us called a family, there's things in the past, there's injuries that have occurred that oftentimes we have to go back because we're Christians, because we believe in reconciliation. We have to go back and heal something in order to begin to go forward. And the reason this is such a big deal, the theologian Richard Rohr says it this way: pain that does not get transformed will get transmitted. Pain that does not get transformed will get transmitted. And you've seen that before, and it's easy to spot in other people, isn't it? It's easy to spot in the girl, who dates all the wrong guys, and you go, well, it's because of her dad, and, they had issues, and she just kind of drags that into the present. And there's something about relationships, especially family relationships, that they don't operate like finances. They don't just sort of segment off into different accounts. They have this way of transmitting. They have that relational pain, especially family pain, can transmit often to the next generation, often to our kids. And so pain that does not get transformed, that we don't go back and heal, can often get transmitted. And it's the reason why what we're going to talk about this morning is such a big deal to you, whether you're a Christian or not, and it's a big deal to God. And you maybe have spent your whole life wishing you were born into a different family. I don't know if that's anybody in the room. Don't raise your hand. It might be awkward for the people in your row, but maybe you've spent your whole life going, I wish somebody would just, I'm convinced these are not my parents. I'm convinced this is not my family. I wish somebody would adopt me, which is weird because you're 40 and you're going, I just wish I could change this whole arrangement. Here's my prayer for this morning: that you'll begin to recognize and open your eyes to the reality that God has you in your family for a specific purpose. And it may be that you're the one, because you're a Christian, maybe in a family where no one else is, that is going to break a cycle of dysfunction, that the buck is going to stop with you, and that the pain that's gone on is not going to keep getting transmitted, but with you it's going to cease, because you're a Christian and you're going to go back and you're going to heal something in order to go forward. So if you have a Bible, we're going to look at this story in Genesis chapter 25. If you don't have a Bible, we're going to put the verses on the screen this morning. Genesis chapter 25. If you've been hanging around church for a while, this is the story of these two brothers, Jacob and Esau. How many of us have heard the story of Jacob and Esau? Been hanging around church for a while. It's one of those that maybe even if you were a little kid got flannel graphed and you saw the goat hair put on the guy's arm. I mean, it's one of those sort of iconic stories that you often get confused. Was that in the Bible or was that a Disney story? I'm not sure. Was that Esau or was that Gaston? I'm not quite sure who's who. But this is one of those stories. And before we get into it, I want to give a little context, because as a pastor, often I'll tell people will say, well, how do I get closer to God? And say, well, read the Bible, which is good advice. When I became a Christian at 18, that's what people told me to do. And so I did. I went out and got a Bible and started reading through the Bible. And I started reading it like I would read any book, just began in the beginning in Genesis and started reading. And I got about 10 chapters in. Have you ever had this feeling, go, these are the most messed up people? Anyone ever thought that? Is this really who God uses? I mean, this is just unbelievable how broken, and at times, and this is often a problem for people when they read these stories, and it's, how could God ordain this? How could this be a part of the world, especially when it comes to families, these stories that we've been looking at? Again and again, you see this, and this for me, I remember was a really sort of big issue. You see that there's polygamy again and again in these family dynamics. There's polygamy where a husband can marry as many wives as he wants. You also see again and again, and these were just ancient institutions of family in the ancient world, in a tribal world. You had polygamy. You also had another practice, which is equally troubling, called primogeniture, which is where the oldest son gets all the blessings and the favor of the father, and the other kids are sort of throwaway kids. And as the youngest kid in my family, that always bothered me. I thought, why would God allow that? But when you read the stories, and if that's ever bothered you, and we're going to bump into those, especially the primogeniture part, we're going to bump into that this morning. When you begin to read the Bible, what you discover is that God allows it. It's a part of the culture, but God never blesses either primogeniture or polygamy. In fact, when it comes to polygamy, it always, when you read the stories, David, whoever it is, it always blows up and becomes a cultural, family, social nightmare for whoever practices it. God never blesses it. And the same is true for primogeniture. God never supports it. In fact, God subverts it again and again. You see this where in these ancient family institutions, it's usually the oldest son that will get the blessings. But when God tells the story, it's the younger son. It's Jacob. It's not Esau in the story that we're going to look at today who gets the blessing. It's Abel. It's not Cain in the book of Genesis. It's Isaac. It's not his brother Ishmael that gets the blessing. And this is just a part of the culture, and God never supports it, he never blesses it. And so when I began to discover that, when I began to realize that God is always one step ahead of his culture, he's always trying to get people to act differently than they're currently behaving, I began to like these stories in a fresh sort of a way. So let's dive into the story. Genesis chapter 25 is where we are going to be, and we're going to get to a new family rule based off of these two brothers this morning. Genesis chapter 25, there's two brothers, Jacob and Esau. One of them, we're told, the older brother Esau is a manly man. He likes to hunt. Jacob likes to cook. That's sort of his thing. They're very different. Here's what it says, Genesis 25, verse 27. They grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter. He's the older brother, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Verse 28, Isaac, this is his younger brother, or Isaac is the father, actually. If you remember from the Bible, Abraham's their grandfather, Isaac's the dad, Rebekah is his wife. They factor into the story in just a moment. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau. He preferred his older son, but Rebekah, the mom, loved Jacob. So right there you have a bit of a weird family dynamic going on where both the parents are playing favorites. Well, if you remember from the story, several things take place. We'll just kind of hit the highlights before we get to the real meat of the story. But several things take place that cause a break in the relationship between these two brothers, Jacob and Esau. The first event, if you remember, one day Esau is out hunting. That's sort of his thing, sort of a Ted Nugent kind of a guy. I don't know if this is the right crowd for a Ted Nugent joke this early in the morning. Grill it and kill it. That's sort of, or kill it and grill it. That's his life motto. So he's out hunting one day, and it says he comes home from hunting, and he's hungry, and he's about to die if he doesn't eat. And so he says to his brother Jacob, will you make me a meal? He's a good cook. Jacob says, sure, but I'll only do it if you decide to give me your birthright, which is a terrible sort of trade. But he does it, and in this culture, your birthright is everything. It's not just sort of like your birth certificate. It's much more. It's a cultural badge of honor. It's your identity is your birthright. And he says, sure, I'm going to die anyway if I don't eat right now. So he trades his birthright. Immediately after this, Jacob cooks the meal. He despises his brother. He despises his birthright. He's angry that his brother had tricked him. So immediately there's this break in the relationship. A painful event occurs. You keep going in the story. You remember this part of the story? Isaac, their dad, Jacob and Esau's dad, is on his deathbed. And in this culture, a father, before he died, would meet with his oldest son. And this is independent of the birthright. He would give a blessing to his oldest son, essentially to say, hey, the reins that I've held in life are now the reins that you're supposed to hold. Well, Rebekah, the mom, she comes to Jacob and she says, look, your brother's away hunting. Your father's about to die. We should trick your father into giving you the blessing instead of your brother Esau. And she says, well, and Jacob says, well, how are we going to do that? She says, well, I got a plan. We're going to put you essentially in like an Esau Halloween costume. We're going to put hair on your arms. We're going to make you smell like Esau. Your dad's half blind anyway. He won't know the difference. We'll send you in there and you'll get the blessing. And so he agrees, puts the goat hair on his arms and goes in and steals the blessing. Genesis chapter 27, verse 27. This is Isaac, the father, who's confused, doesn't realize that he's talking to Jacob, not Esau. The smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. I love that verse. I pray that verse over my kids every time I change their diapers. It's yet to work, but maybe you'll have better luck than me. The smell of my son is like the smell of a field. I did that last night while I was changing Hayden, my youngest, diaper, and Rosanna's like, what are you doing? I was like, I'm trying it, rolling the dice. Verse 28. May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness and abundance. He's giving the blessing away, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations, and this is where the blessing gets a little strange, may nations serve you and people bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers. That's critical. It's going to come back into the story later. He says, Isaac, you're the Lord over your brothers, and may the son of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. And so now Jacob has stolen the blessing and the birthright from his brother Esau. It was supposed to go to the oldest son. Jacob, the youngest, has stolen the birthright and the blessing. Well, Esau comes home from hunting, finds out what happens, and as you would imagine, he's furious. And so he decides he's going to kill his brother. That's what he tells people. I'm going to kill him for what he's done, not just once, but twice. Well, Rebecca, the mom, she gets wind of what Esau's plans are, and she comes to Jacob and she says, Jacob, we got a problem. Your brother wants you to die. And Jacob's thinking, well, this is all your fault, Mom. You kind of got me into this mess. And so he decides to do what a lot of us have decided to do when there's family drama. He just moves out of town. And he just moves. It says he goes and he lives with his uncle. His name's Laban. This all takes place in a town called Beersheba, which ironically is the hometown of Carl Strauss. This takes place in... These are good morning jokes. I thought I'd just sort of throw in there for you. The other services don't get this stuff, just you guys at 8:30. He leaves Beersheba. He flees to a town called Haran, where he's going to live with his uncle named Laban. And it says 20 years go by. He gets married a couple times, has a couple wives, Leah and Rachel, if you remember them from the story. He gets married. He becomes a successful businessman in Haran. And 20 years go by, and he does what a lot of us have done when there's been a break in the past, when there's been a family injury. He just forgets about it. He just turns the page. He just tries to move on. He avoids the phone calls. He just sort of, turns the answering machine on. He just decides, I'm no longer going to deal with the family drama that happened in Beersheba. I'm just going to move on. And one day, 20 years have gone by. God comes to him and says, Jacob, it's time to go home. Jacob, you got to go back and heal the broken relationship with your brother. And I don't know why this is, but I've experienced it in my life, and I guarantee you some of us in this room, you've experienced it as well, or some of you will experience it. That oftentimes in our lives, to move forward, we have to go back to something. If you're a brand new Christian, there might be, as you begin to learn a new way of operating in the world, operating based on God's design of forgiveness and grace and peace, there might have been things in your past that you shut the door on. People, relationships that you offended or you were offended, things that broke, bridges that got burned. And because you're a Christian now, you will have to go back and heal the injury in order to go forward. And God comes to Jacob and says, you got to go back. And he's thinking the exact same thing you and I are thinking, but I've moved on. What if it doesn't work? Why would I go back? It's not going to work. I remember Esau. He's just angry. He's just always going to be angry. It's just a part of it. And I've just moved on. God, let me just move on. And God says, no, you got to go back so that you can go forward. And so he begins the journey. 20 years have gone by to try to go back and heal an injury so that he can go forward. He obeys the voice of God. And here's what the story says. 20 years have gone by. And it says, Genesis chapter 32, starting in verse 3, Jacob's a wealthy man. He's got a really successful business at this point. It says that Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir. So he finds out where his brother lives in the country of Edom. And he instructed them, this is what you are to say to my lord Esau. Notice the language there. He's essentially trying to extend an olive branch. He's the one that's been declared by Isaac the Lord over his brothers. And he's trying to flip the script and say, no, I stole the blessing. And I want when you go and you try to make peace with him and bring him back to me, I want him to know right away that I understand I stole the birthright and the blessing. He's calling his brother Lord. He says, I want you to tell him this. Your servant Jacob says this, I have been staying with Laban, our uncle, and have remained there until now, 20 years. Verse 5, I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goats, male and female servants, sort of a non-humble brag there. Now I am sending this message to my Lord, to Esau. He's sending this message that I might find favor in your eyes. Verse 6, it says the messengers go, they tell Esau, 20 years have gone by, but Jacob wants to reconnect. When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, we went to your brother Esau. And he says, we got some good news and we got some bad news. We went to your brother Esau and now he's coming to meet you. And this part I've always loved. And 400 men are with him. Didn't see that one coming. I don't even think the Bible had to add this next line, but they do anyway. Verse 7, in great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups. and the flocks and the herds and the camels as well. He thought if Esau comes and attacks one group, this group that is left may escape. In other words, he's got to have a back out plan. He's got to have an exit strategy. What if this doesn't work? What if God has led me like a lamb to a slaughter? 400 men, I've got to have some sort of, what if it all falls apart? Keep going to verse 13. I love what the sort of plan that he concocts here. It says he spends the night there and he's still terrified. And he begins to pray. He's going, God, what am I supposed to do? And it says, and from what he had with him, he selected a gift for his brother Esau. He tries to pay him off. He says 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 female camels. He basically takes half of Ramona with him to meet his brother. 40 cows and 10 bulls. 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. I think you could have stopped with just the female, but he just keeps going. Verse 16, he put them in the care of his servants, each herd by itself, and said to his servants, go ahead of me and keep some space between the herds. And so essentially what he does is he sets up like a goat procession to go in front of him to meet his brother Esau. This is one of my favorite stories in the entire Bible. It's hard to tell from the text, but it looks like 7 or 8 different rows of animals. And he says, okay, the first one, I want you to carry all these goats, all these sheep. I want you to carry them to Esau. And then this is what I want you to say. And the same thing to the second, the same thing to the third. So hundreds and hundreds of farm animals essentially are going to go ahead of him. He instructed the one in the lead. When my brother Esau meets you and asks, who do you belong to and where you go? In other words, he's going to be confused. You are to say, and he's going to ask you who owns all these animals in front of you. Then you are to say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau. And he's coming behind us. Verse 19, he also instructed the second, the third, and all the others who followed with the herds. You are to say the same thing to Esau when you meet him. And be sure to say this. Don't forget this part. Your servant Jacob is coming behind us. And he's essentially thinking, well, I know I stole the birthright and the blessing 20 years ago, but maybe if I give him a zoo, this will sort of ease the burden a little bit. And he sends all these animals in front of him. You know why he does this? Because the same, you've never done that before, but we've sort of done similar things. Because he's thinking, what if it doesn't work? What's my plan going to be? What if he doesn't reciprocate? You ever had that feeling and that emotion before when you go to reconcile a broken relationship, maybe not even with a family member, maybe with somebody else? What if it doesn't work? What if they don't accept my phone call? What if they don't respond to my email? What if they do respond to my email and theirs is in all caps because they're still really, really angry over what happened? What if they tell me you're still worried about that or you're still bothered by that? Get over it. What if they don't reciprocate? Because what we value in the process, or what we value as we try to heal a broken relationship, what we value, and it's human nature and it's good, but what we value is reciprocation. We want them to return the I'm sorry. We want them to extend the olive branch back, but that's often not even what God's interested in. And he's terrified, as he should be, and often we're terrified like we should be when we go to try to make peace with a family member because there's an injury in the past. And what we want to see happen and what we value in those moments is, are they going to reciprocate? But often God has a different agenda and a different goal. And it's in the process of going to meet with his brother to reconcile, something incredible happens along the way. God meets with him when he's terrified. In prayer, God meets with him. You remember this story? If you've been hanging around church for a while, God meets him on the road. He wrestles with God. And God gives him a new name and says, you're going to be called Israel. He blesses him essentially. A nation is going to rise up through you. From the perspective of world history, it's a fascinating story because of Israel and the implications even in 2016 of Israel. It begins right here in this moment. He blesses Jacob. He changes Jacob. He transforms Jacob. That only happens because he's pursuing reconciliation. What God values, here's how the story goes. Just to read the line, just about 8 verses down in the story, Genesis chapter 32, it says, then the man, this is an angel, meets Jacob on the road and he says, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and you have overcome. Jacob says, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? It's an angel. Then he blessed him right there. That happened. He gets renamed Israel. He gets transformed. In the process of pursuing reconciliation, of going back to heal something. That only happens because he's trying to make something right. I'm not even sure I fully even understand the connection, but I would be willing to bet this. God will do something in you, or God will do something through you that you did not expect in the process of you trying to pursue reconciliation with a family member. I've seen it 100 times in my own life. Many of us in this room, you could stand up and tell the same story. That God did something serendipitous. God did something you did not expect. It was not your goal. You just wanted reciprocation. You just wanted them to say, I'm sorry back. But in the process of pursuing healing and of a broken relationship, God did something in you and God did something through you that you did not expect. And I can't promise based on the Bible that if you go try to make peace that they're going to reciprocate. But I guarantee you this, you will have a story. I don't know what it'll be, of something God did in you or something God did through you. In the process, he meets Jacob on the road, renames him, he transforms Jacob in the process of pursuing reconciliation. You could say it this way, it's a new family rule to hang on the refrigerator. As we pursue reconciliation, God will begin to pursue our transformation. I don't know what the story will be. I don't know how you're going to tell the story. I don't know what it'll be. But if you look for it in the process of you pursuing reconciliation in a broken relationship, God will begin to transform you. And often he has a completely different agenda than your agenda and my agenda. And if you could pull back the curtain, you'll tell the story years later. God did something through that I didn't expect and I didn't see coming. It happened to Jacob. God meets with him, renames him, transforms him in the process of pursuing reconciliation. You keep going in the story. It's not just Jacob who's going to get transformed, but somebody else was there that day. Keep reading in the story, Genesis chapter 33. So all the animals, the goats, they've all gone forward in the procession. It says this, Genesis 33, verse 1. Jacob looked up, and there was Esau. 20 years have gone by, and he's coming with his 400 men. So he has his kids with him, it says. I'm not even sure that's good parenting, but it says he divides the children among Leah, Rachel, these are his wives, are the two female servants. Verse 2, he put the female servants and their children in the front. I guess he didn't care as much about them. He put the female servants and their children in the front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel, and don't miss this part, and Joseph in the rear. Remember Joseph? Technicolor dream coat, remember this story? Joseph is a little boy, and he's sitting on the back of a camel that day. We'll get to Joseph's story in just a minute. And Rachel and Joseph in the rear. He himself, this is Jacob, went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. 20 years have gone by. But Esau ran to meet Jacob, and he embraced him, and he threw his arms around his neck. He reciprocates, and he kissed him, and they wept. And then Esau looked up and saw the women and the children, and he said, who are these with you? In other words, I have some in-laws I didn't know about. He asked Jacob, then he answered, they are the children God has graciously given to your servant. Verse 6, then the female servants and their children approached, and they bowed down. One of the most powerful scenes in the entire Bible. Verse 7, next Leah and her children came, and they bowed down. Last of all came Joseph, there he is again, and Rachel, and they too bowed down. Verse 8, Esau asked the logical question, what's the meaning of all the flocks and herds I met? In other words, what's with the goats? And he says, to find favor in your eyes, my Lord. As I read back through this story this past week, the thing that I just couldn't get out of my head and heart is the fact that Joseph was there that day. Remember Joseph? Pastor Harry's going to tell this story next week. If you don't, just be here. If you have plans already, just clear your schedule. You need to be here next week for Father's Day because it's one of the most powerful stories in the Bible. Joseph is a little boy, but Joseph, if you remember from the story, he's going to grow up. And when he's 17 years old, just a few short years after this, his brothers are going to sell him into slavery. They're going to wrong him. And through a horrible chain of events, all these things are going to happen in Joseph's life. 20 years are going to go by, and he's going to have been betrayed by his brothers, and he's going to grow up, remember this story, to become one of the most powerful men in the entire world. And he's going to have an opportunity 20 years later in his late 30s to kill his brothers for what they did to him, and he doesn't. What does he do? He forgives his brothers. And I just can't help but think when I read the story, Moses could have put a lot of different names in there of all the kids, but he decided to put Joseph's name in there for a reason. Because when Joseph forgave his brothers all those years later, I just have to think it was seared into his heart, the memory of watching his father bow down in front of his uncle that day as he sat on the back of a camel. Sometimes reconciliation is not about you and that person. Sometimes it's about the next generation and your kids that are watching. And it's the model and the example that you set. And from the vantage point of Jacob on this particular afternoon, this is about me and Esau reconnecting. It's about me going back to go forward. But if you pull back the curtain on the story, God was in the process, not just of transforming Jacob, not just of renaming Jacob, but God was in the process of transforming his little boy's heart to be the kind of man who would one day grow up and choose peace over hate towards his brothers. You have no idea what hangs in the balance with your decision to reconcile. You don't know what God will do. And you're like me, you go, what if it doesn't work? God has a different definition of what works than you and I do. And what we want is a reciprocation. What God wants is the process. I'll do something in you. I'll do something in the heart of your kids. I want them to watch. Reconciliation is often not about you or me. It's often just about the next generation that's watching to see what you're going to do. And we go, but I've tried. I made a phone call. They didn't call me back. I've done everything. You have people tell you this along the way. You've done all that you can do. Time to give up. You ever said that to yourself before? You know when we can give up trying to pursue reconciliation with someone? When God gives up on you. That's when you can give up. That's when I can give up. And when's God ever going to give up on trying to reconcile a broken relationship with you and with me? He's never going to give up. Some of us in this room, or all of us in this room, the only reason you're here is because you have a Father in heaven who's absolutely relentless in pursuing you in spite of your behavior to reconcile a broken relationship with you. Some of us in this room, you're not a Christian yet, but you will be. Not because of good sermons or not because of songs, but because of a Father in heaven who's absolutely relentless in pursuing and reconciling a relationship with you that's broken. And God went and spared no expenses, even the life of his son, to reconcile to you and to me. And he says again and again in the New Testament, I want you to go reconcile. Go back, heal it, to go forward, pursue reconciliation. And I can't wait to hear the stories. Who knows what God will do through your decision, through my decision, to go back, to heal something that's broken so that we can go forward. Let's pray together this morning. God, it's such a powerful scene. And I pray over sons and daughters. I pray over uncles and aunts. I pray anywhere there's brokenness, God, anywhere where there's been pain, a break in a relationship, would you rush in? God, you're in the business of putting things back together. God, often I'm in the business of tearing them apart. And God, I pray for a father who's on the fence. God, maybe it's not about him and his brother or him and his ex-wife. Maybe it's just about his kids that are watching. And something's going to get seared into their heart because of his choices, one way or the other. God, I pray for family members here that this is going to bring up a lot of conversations. There's somebody they need to call. There's someone back east. There's somebody that they've lost touch with that they need to heal. They got to go back to go forward. God, would you give us courage this week? Would you give a blessing to us that we didn't expect? Would you transform us as we pursue reconciliation in broken places? It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, as always, we have counselors and people that are down front to pray with you after the service if you need prayer. Next week is Father's Day. I would encourage you to come back. Don't miss Pastor Harry's message next week. It's going to be incredible. It's going to be an amazing weekend of all kinds of fun stuff here at the church. So be here next week. Thank you so much for being here this morning. Hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Go in peace today, my friends. God bless you.